into the Ghana case. So Ghana as a case study for what I'm trying to put across, and then put across some conclusions. Once we are done with that, we can have a discussion. Yeah. So this wasn't originally part of my presentation, so you get to be the first audience to see this aspect of what my work is and how I'm thinking about things. I don't know if you can make sense of this at all. Maybe I should ask, or maybe just jot it somewhere in your head what you think is actually going on here. So in picture 1, there's a plate and there's some sort of ID in that plate with a spoon and water by it. The next picture is the ID in the middle of bread, like it's some jam or some butter or some margarine. Then here again you have the card. Somebody, this is the nozzle, and as if it's putting fuel, the person is putting fuel into the car. Then the next picture, you find the same card again in a pot over a stove. Here too, another person, different person again with the same card, and then a mansion or a house, more like a house. And here too, you have the card by an electricity meter. The question is, what is really going on in these pictures? So this is something that has been trending in Ghana over the last few weeks, and I thought that it was very interesting because it reaches the core of the discussions and conversations that I've been trying to have with myself and with others. So you can read all of those pictures before here as some form of protest to this particular statement. The person you have here is Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia, who is the vice president of Ghana, and as he has been awarded in not too long ago, he has been deemed as the digital man of the year, I think 2 years ago. And I don't know what it really means to be called the digital man of the year. But when you are thinking about identification systems, if you are thinking about technology systems as policies in Ghana, there's been a lot of recent investments, and this vice president has been the face of it. So all the pictures that you saw earlier are in response to this statement that the vice president recently made. He said, "A lot of people sometimes don't even appreciate what the impact of the Ghana card is. But if you gave me 1,000 interchanges, so road interchanges, and the Ghana card, I would choose the Ghana card because it has more impact on development." So here is the vice president trying to situate the value of the Ghana card. So for those who do not know, the Ghana card is the national biometric ID card for Ghanaians. Trying to situate this card in the context of physical infrastructural development, and making the point that for him, when it comes to what will get Ghana to the point of socio-economic development that it wants or prefers, it will be more the Ghana card than physical infrastructure, basically. So think about the 1,000 interchanges in the context of physical infrastructure. So the card on one hand and physical infrastructure on the other hand. And you find all of these pictures preceding here to be people protesting that. How are they protesting it? Basically, they are saying that, maybe if I can go back to those pictures, they're saying that in the picture on your left, that the Ghana card, so this is almost like meme territory as at this point. Well, your Ghana card cannot buy me a house. Well, your Ghana card cannot bring me electricity. Well, your Ghana card cannot fill my tank. Well, your Ghana card cannot put food on my table. Yeah, and these also speak to the issue of food. So this is basically hashtag movement, but also a form of protestation by the citizenry in the context of what the vice president had said. Ghana card may be important, but is this the most important thing the people were asking? The puzzle that underlies my work has been this, that for the longest while, as somebody in surveillance studies, you find the big argument of whether surveillance is good or surveillance is bad. And all around the world, I would say that people approach the concept of surveillance differently, but when you look at global South countries, what you find is that there's often the attachment of development to surveillance. And you can see it in some of these examples on your screen. ID4D, Identification for Development by the World Bank. You find USAID also having this document, how to create digital ID for inclusive development. Then there's the Identification Evolution by Alan Gelb, who has been working for the ID4D project. All of these projects saying that for global South countries to attain development or to pursue development, identification systems are crucial. Identification systems are important. So on one hand, you are bringing two concepts together. One that has generally been deemed as negative, at least in surveillance studies literature, which is surveillance. And on the other hand, something that has been always deemed as positive, development. So mine is to understand whether this is the irony of this or the paradox of this. But in the specific context of surveillance studies too, you find that good and bad have been translated into care and control. So care will be good, control will be bad. And the most probably impactful and deep debate about these concepts of care and control have been had by James Harden and David Lyon. If you've not had an opportunity to read them on these issues, please do, where James Harden basically makes the argument that we cannot salvage surveillance at this point. The moment surveillance mixed up with capitalism, it's became impermeably and permanently dangerous. And David Lyon is always trying to come back to the center to say that, well, we have to still think about surveillance in the context of a continuum, that we cannot just give it an attribute of being bad or only being used for control, but see the context within which it is used before we can assess it or before we can judge it. But I always take the position of James Scott, who says that for good or for bad, the state must see first. So for him, the state can only be effective, the state can only be functional if it can see. But what it actually does with that vision, that sight of society is a different conversation. But for a lot of African countries, a lot of global South countries, I think that is the point where they are now, where the argument seems to be that, okay, because the state has not been able to see, that is why maybe we don't have the level of socio-economic development or even state competence that we have pursued or that we've wanted in historically and also for the future, I would say. But I always want to also emphasize the point that the IDs that we are talking about today are very different. These are not your typical ID cards, the old ID cards, very analog systems where you just go and show your ID card. Somebody looks at the picture on the card and looks at your face and goes like, okay, this is you or this is not you. We are talking really about deeper systems. And that is where I get the idea of surveillance-oriented identification systems from. David Lyon makes a very good point that we are not dealing anymore with what we would call maybe an ID document, but what you are dealing with is an identification system. If you think about the potential for amalgamation, the potential for profiling, the potential for creating double versions of a person, then you see the value of the identification system that we have now, considering ideas like biometrics, like GPS that are embedded in some of these identification systems or identification tools that we have today. And another key dimension that makes these IDs different is what Louise Amoore calls the governance by risk, where the profiles that have been created by the current crop of identification systems that we have now also get an attribution of risk or a risk value. So somebody builds a system and has a certain assessment of who is risky. And if your profiling per your identification meets that value, then you are deemed to be risky, and that is how come certain categories of persons have been targeted, although they've not done any wrong. So we are not just thinking about, oh, this is an ID card. When I look at it, your face is on it, your name is on it. It is exactly who is standing in front of me, so it is enough. You must not do anything wrong now, just because of the ID that you find yourself to possess and that is being processed. You are given a certain risk value. Then another important work for me is Keith Breckenridge, who has talked about the transition from the documentary to the biometric state. And basically for him, the biometric state is a state that tries to have a universal register of the biometrics of its citizens. And for a lot of countries, that is where they are going to, especially in the global South. And another important concept has been Haggerty and Erickson's surveillance assemblage, because what these new ID systems make possible is the idea that we can actually combine. We can combine the information that the police has, just because we have because if you take the Ghana card, for instance, the Ghana card is able to hold 14 different applications, which means that we can have your national health records on it. We can have your social insurance records on it. And that means that at any point in time, we can cross-tabulate. At any point in time, we can assemble. And we can have different versions of the same person because of that possibility. If I combine information on your health with the information that I get from the police on you, there's possibly a different version of you compared to if I just took information on your frequency in terms of paying tax, for instance. So it is in these senses that the IDs that we are talking about now are very different. So, case study, Ghana. I always get the question, why Ghana? I'll say that, okay, I know Ghana the best. Ghana is my country. So it was easier for me to get as much information as I wanted on the case, and for me to also relate with the people and to also appreciate their own concerns and their own justifications for some of these systems. This is the bigger agenda in Ghana. It is now referred to as the Digital Ghana Agenda. And the goal is to create, to a certain extent, a certain vision for the state. MNI here refers to mobile number interoperability. So the vision is simple. You get your Ghana card, you register your SIM card with your Ghana card, and then you also have your digital address system. And then put together, you can have a bank account or mobile money account sitting on your phone, and you can then tie that mobile money account to your bank account, which creates a lot of visibilities, because by having a Ghana card, it means that the state knows you. And then if you use that Ghana card to register for a SIM card, then it means that the state knows that you are owning this specific phone. And if you use that SIM card to get a mobile money account, then the state knows that, okay, this mobile money account belongs to this person. And then if you connect it to your bank account, there's more visibility there. The digital addressing system, I'll talk about it briefly. It's also basically the whole country divided into digital address grids, so GPS systems. Where you live, you get a specific digital address for that. So if in all of these registrations, you are also submitting your digital address, then we don't just know who you are, we also know where you live. Underlying my work have been two main questions. How do state and non-state actors justify or challenge citizen identification systems? And what are the implications of framing surveillance systems as necessary for development? And in doing this work, what I've basically done is to pay attention to four main categories of actors: state actors, civil society actors, local tech companies, international actors. I've always been interested in how they accept these systems or how they resist or challenge these systems. Let me just quickly say that in doing this, there are a lot of different identification systems that the state is pursuing in Ghana, but I've just focused on SIM card registration, digital addresses, and national ID system. So SIM card registration will mean that you go and register your SIM card, as I said earlier. There's a point that this is a bit different from probably what happens in a lot of global north countries, because typically you find that SIM registration is the use of phones, mobile phones in a place like Ghana tend to be more of prepaid than postpaid, which is quite different if you compare to places like Canada, where it's a lot of times you get a bill after usage. And digital addresses just meant that the whole country was subdivided into 5x5 grids digitally, and then GPS addresses were imposed. So depending on where you stood to generate a digital address using an app, then it will mean that you have a unique digital address, which tells us that the state was trying to possibly jump over the hurdle of not being capable of putting in place a uniform addressing system over time. by trying to use technology to do that. If you think about the biometric national ID system too, in a certain sense, the state was trying to jump over the hurdle of not being able to identify its citizens, know who is who, and be able to distinguish who from who by coming up with this biometric system and trying to use, again, technology to overcome what I would call long-standing institutional constraints and challenges and impermeabilities. In thinking about the SIM card registration, I've always conceived it as the state trying to tie citizens to their phone numbers. So the state then basically gets into your pocket and knows where you are, who you are at the same time. In trying to understand the justifications for it, one very important document that I came across was the Subsidiary Legislative Committee. So this was a subcommittee in Ghana's parliament trying to justify why SIM card registration was important. And these were the logics that they espoused, that the registration would protect life and property to create the enabling environment necessary for the socio-economic development of the country. And as you see throughout these justifications, socio-economic development became a strong part of the conception of development by a lot of those supporting these systems. So SIM card registration would protect life and property to create the enabling environment necessary for the socio-economic development of the country. So here too, there's the conception or the component, I would say, of security. And the digital address too, I summarize it as the state trying to tie citizens to GPS coordinates. The National Digital Property Addressing System is NDPAS, and when this was being also rolled out, the Deputy Minister of Communications at the time justified it in this way, that the NDPAS will facilitate the formalization of the economy as it provides a unique digital address for properties and businesses for easier identification and tracking by relevant institutions. So when it comes to something like taxation, for instance, then this was going to be a very useful tool. And pay attention to the use of the expression formalization of the economy, because this has also become a very big deal in the global south, where the idea of inclusiveness or financial inclusion is tied to the fact that, these economies tend to have huge informal sectors, and by having such tools, we are able to formalize the sectors, which means that basically we are able to get businesses and citizens to be recognized by the state and then to be trackable by the state. Then the biggest project of all is the Ghana Card project, and here too I frame it as tying citizenship to a card and biometrics. And the National Identification Authority, which is in charge of the implementation of the project, justifies it in this sense, that if your personal information is not in the National Identification Register, you may be excluded from the formal economy of Ghana and lose out on several social, economic, and political benefits. So one food for thought immediately has been, what is the value of the formal economy? Or maybe put differently, does the informal economy threaten the state or the state's capacity or the state's performance? Or do we need to change it at all? And the mastermind, as I introduced earlier, the vice president of Ghana, puts all of these together in a very interesting way. When I say all of these different projects together in a very interesting way to give the core rationale for what is going on. He says, I think if we have the digital addressing system, the national ID system, and then you have interoperability in the digital payment space, you would have dealt with the engine that is going to drive this economic transformation. Again, economic transformation. Those are the unwritten rules of the game. And I think they will have a major impact as far as economic development is concerned. Again, economic development comes up. If I'm taking anything away from this, I'm taking the emphasis on economic development, economic transformation, and written rules of the game, and the idea that this would be the engine. But key also is the word interoperability. Again, it shows how these IDs are different from the IDs that we used in the past, which were connected to nothing. Physical, analog, I see your face on the card, it's enough. But these ID systems are actually interconnected so that they are interoperable. And the interoperability may be national, but then sometimes it's also international. In terms of the implications of the Digital Ghana agenda so far, I've been trying to think about the critical policy junctures or the moments in terms of policy making and and their implications. No, so the touchy or sensitive moments in terms of policy making and implementation for rights, human rights. One policy was that if you don't do or undertake or undergo SIM registration, you are not going to have a phone number. That is how the state has been, how far the state is willing to go. And the state says that if you don't have a digital address, you will not have a Ghana card. So to register for a Ghana card, you must have generated a digital address first. So again, if you start thinking about it, then your citizenship and the rights that accrue from your status as a citizen is now being tied to a digital address. No voters ID for Ghana card registration. So historically, for some contests, Ghanaians over time had bigger access to the voters ID card than any other card. Of course, some will say that, well, this serves the interest of the political elites, the political class. But when it was time for Ghana card registration, the government said that, or the state said that, well, you cannot use this card, which is the most popular, you cannot use it for your Ghana card registration. And the logic behind it was that over time, the state did not trust itself, that it had done a good job in ensuring that those who actually held a voter's ID card were people who were actually supposed to be nationals and citizens who had the right to hold that card. In other words, they felt some foreigners held voters' ID card. So if you made that a basis for Ghana card registration, then maybe you could be undermining the sanctity of that registration. And then the state said, no Ghana card, no voter registration. So now you see how the interoperability also works in a very funny way when it comes to rights, because the state wants this to be connected, and it will go to a very far extent to ensure that it does that. No Ghana card, no voter registration. So if you held a voter's ID, you cannot use that for your Ghana card registration. If you don't have a Ghana card, in subsequent years, you cannot vote or you cannot register to vote. See how your rights will be impeded on here. No Ghana card, no SIM registration. So now it's becoming like, whether you may think of it as a virtuous cycle or you may think of it as a vicious cycle, but think about interoperability in this sense too. No Ghana card, no business registration. No Ghana card, no bank account. And then the state also set up what it called the Common Monitoring Platform, using the argument that they cannot track international calls that land in Ghana or that come into Ghana. And by so doing, they cannot trust the revenues that mobile network operators were declaring. So let's have a system that allows us to know the international calls that come to Ghana. So they set up the Common Monitoring Platform. But the biggest debate at the time was, is this monitoring platform not capable of listening into calls or seeing our messages? Was it not capable of knowing the content of communication? Although the state was just promising that we are not interested in the content, we just want to know when the phone call came in and when it ended. But the question has always been, if you have that capacity, what more must you do to ensure that you also know the content of our phone calls and our messages? Then when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, the state took advantage of it to pass the Emergency Communication System Instrument, EI 63. Enshrined in it was the idea of SIM registration, which was not new, but also the idea of the IMEI registration, so International Mobile Equipment Instrument, identity. So every phone has an IMEI. And in previous years, the state had always gestured towards trying to have people register not only their SIM cards, but also their IMEI, which means that we are not just tracking the SIM. Now we could also have the ability to track the phone itself without the SIM. And that was difficult to pass over the years. But in the name of COVID, in the name of fighting emergencies when they come up, the states use that as an opportunity to have an instrument like the EI63, which doesn't only enshrine SIM registration, but also IMEI registration. Probably the positive aspect at the end of the day was that there was a court ruling that said that the EI63, in terms of sanctioning SIM registration, should not be seen as legal or should not be deemed as legal, or probably simply put is illegal. But the fact of the matter is that still SIM registration has gone on and is persevering. So in terms of the implementation of that legal ruling or that legal decision, it's still touchy and tricky for me, because I don't know the extent to which that ruling should have gone or meant. Because if the court is basically saying that, well, you can't sanction SIM registration through this instrument, then I also assume that you can sanction IMEI registration through this instrument, but it is still going on. So was the court, or is the court saying that it is okay with SIM registration in principle, or it has a problem just in the context of the EICC3, where SIM registration is deemed to be an emergency measure? So let me bring a lot more clarity to what the emergency communication system instrument meant. It was used as a tool to then force the hand of mobile network operators to all have SIM registration mechanisms and also IMEI registration mechanisms. But in as much as I have always argued that from my interactions with various non-state actors, they are not necessarily against these citizen identification systems, there have been concerns that have been raised over the years about and around these projects. So these color boxes show different arguments or different sides of the concerns. The first one is Alhaji Musa Yakubu, who at the time was the General Secretary of the Fulani Welfare Group. So for those who don't know the Fulani is a nomadic transhumant group across West Africa. So you tend to find them across various countries in West Africa, and they typically have been herdsmen, so they move along with their livestock. And this has created questions and challenges for them in the context of citizenship. So where do they actually belong? So that's some context for the Fulani people. So the General Secretary, in terms of the Ghana card, made this point that Fulanis who have lived here here means Ghana, for over 70 years, 80 years are being denied. This is a valid birth. So this is a valid birth certificate. Somebody had gone to register for the Ghana card, and the person had been refused, so he was speaking to that issue. This is a valid birth certificate, a valid passport of somebody, and they are being denied the national identification card. I don't know why. Our forefathers were here long before independence, long before the Constitution. And this point is very important for me, because in my work, I dedicate a whole chapter to the history of citizen identification in Ghana. And to make the point that even before Ghana gained its independence in 1957, the concept of citizenship was murky. It wasn't too clear who was a citizen, because there had been a lot of movements into this country, also aided by colonialism. For instance, when we think about how the original army or the original police forces were formed in Ghana, there were a lot of foreigners brought in because of their stature, because of the fact that they could ride horses. So by the time Ghana got independent, it was saddled with this question of citizenship, and this has lived on till date, such that it is denying people from accessing the Ghana card. Then there is the STRANIC. The STRANIC is supposed to be a civil society organization, but I think it's more of a very partisan civil society organization. But still, their point here is valid. And here they were talking about the digital addresses system. STRANIC will also like to know categorically if there is anything proprietary about this project that warrants the cost currently being bandied about by government sources, because if this project is structured on existing platforms that are provided freely by various third parties, then what amount of work accumulated into the 15 million Ghana cedi contract price? So this was a civil society organization, or maybe perfectly put, they are more like a pressure group. I think that is fair. Complaining about the cost of the digital addressing system. At that time, it had been indicated that $2.5 million had been spent on the digital addressing system. And I have to explain that the front-facing part of that system is an app. So the Ghana Post GPS app, where people just download and then they can stand anywhere to generate a digital address or a GPS coordinate. But the truth of the matter is that this was very similar or probably the same as somebody using Google Maps to generate a digital address. And because of that, people did not see the innovation in it to warrant a $2.5 million investment. So cost also became a reason why people were concerned about this project. And of course, many other projects where there have been questions about accountability, probity, transparency, as they apply to how much is being invested or claimed or supposedly being invested in these projects, and also who is even getting the contract. So there are all of these political economy concerns around these projects in Ghana. So that is also a key concern that has come up. Then in the green box is Aloteji Corps, who is now, I don't know, but he used to be a member of the opposition party now, the NDC. And he makes this point. Why are we in a hurry to have Ghana card? Everybody is complaining about their roads. People are complaining about health facilities. People are complaining about schools under trees. So why is our priority the Ghana card? He asked. Frankly speaking, at the time that I was doing the research for the work, this might have seemed a bit short-sighted. Why would somebody frame the questions this way? Why would somebody not see the connection between having a strong citizen identification system and then development, basically? But if you can go back to the pictures that I showed in the beginning, that point is being made by the people. Once they put their Ghana card in the middle of sliced bread, once they put the Ghana card in their petrol tank, they are making that same point, that similar point that, okay, can we not fix the economy? Can we not ensure that when it comes to employment, people are getting jobs, people are getting well paid? Can the Ghana card ensure that? Or those are the more pressing issues to resolve? Even if you have a successful Ghana card project, maybe these are the institutional aspects of it that you have to resolve. Then in the last box is Imani Ghana. Imani Ghana is also a very respected think tank in Ghana, and they make a lot of pronouncements on these citizen identification systems. And they say, if a citizen has another means of proving their citizenship, such as a passport or birth certificate, then they cannot be compelled to carry a particular card to access any privilege due them as a citizen. So this is the context. The context is that if you can go back to probably the slide before here, the state has been very picky and very selective. In fact, in a very selfish way, in terms of how one can prove their citizenship. So when it comes to the Ghana card, as I explained earlier, oh no, you cannot use your voter's ID card. Does it make sense? If you really think about it, anybody with a voter's ID card is supposed to be a citizen. So why can I not use my Ghana and my voter's ID card to prove my citizenship? But here, Imani is making the critical point that if I am accessing service from the state, or in fact from any private institution, the key idea is that you want to prove my status as a person. You want to prove my identity, or probably authenticate or verify my identity. Must it necessarily be a specific card to do that job? Why should a bank, for instance, say that I'm only accepting a Ghana card if you want to set up a bank account? What about the passport? What about the birth certificate? After all, it is the same state that issues the passport. It's the same state that issues the birth certificate. It's the same state that issued the voter's ID card. Why should the state say that you cannot get a voter's ID card if you don't bring a Ghana card? Isn't it the same state that issued the voter's ID card? And if you really think about it, why should my rights and status as a citizen flow from the possession of a specific card? In fact, the law backing the deployment of the Ghana card is very specific in that it states the mandatory uses of the card. And sometimes, if you really think about the implication of fully realizing those mandatory uses, that means that you basically can do nothing. You cannot access social welfare. You cannot buy a property. You cannot register your SIM card. You basically will become non-functioning in Ghana if the state was supposed to be very insistent on those mandatory provisions in terms of the use of the Ghana card in law. This again means that we have to be very careful about the kind of laws that we make, because even these concerns are in the context where the full realization of the mandatory uses of the Ghana card have not been insisted on by the state yet. More comments. So this was a comment by Hackman Owusu-Agyemang, who used to be an MP and also used to be a minister. And he was speaking on SIM registration when it came up as a subject in Parliament or the legislature. He said, "We do not want any big brother state in this country. We have freedom. Let us have freedom, but within the confines of the law." I'll point out that this submission was made somewhere in 2011, 2012, and his government at the time was in opposition. But I can probably say that when his government came into office, they've been probably more insistent on these same things that he at the time may have classified as creating a big brother state. So here, the traditional logic of surveillance creates a big brother state, as you typically find in European, in global North conversations, comes up. But it is very important for us to understand that, or at least in my own calculation, it is not the mainstay argument. So, for instance, the surveillance literature will always play up security versus privacy. But my work is basically to show that it's broader than that, it's deeper than that, once you situate it in the context of development in the global south. Then the next comment in the, what color is this? Mauve, magenta, it's purple. This was somebody whose grandmother had gone to register for the Ghana card. And this was the concern that the person raised. My grandmother doesn't know anything about this digital address. So how do you force her to get one before receiving her card? As I've said, the National Education Authority was very insistent that if you do not come to the registration center with a digital address, and a digital address is supposed to show your residence, supposed to be your house number, this typically is the responsibility of the state that they were shifting onto people. If you cannot show a digital address, then we are not going to register you. And this lady was complaining, like, my grandmother doesn't know anything about the digital address. Why are you forcing her? Why should her citizenship as a status and as a right emanate from the possession of the Ghana card or the non-possession of the digital address? Better put. Then Bright Simmons, who is also with Imani Ghana, I spoke about Imani as a very respectable think tank in Ghana, makes this point about the digital address. He says, there are 120,000 homeless people in Accra alone, and an estimated 5.4 million slum dwellers in Ghana. Most of these people have no fixed address. How do you then tie a national ID system to an untested digital address? Do these decision makers understand their own country? So again, for context, the digital address would basically mean that you stand in your house, you take your phone, you go to the Ghana Post GPS app, you generate address, and from then onwards, you submit that to the state and say that, oh, this is my address. So his point was that, well, we are also living in a country where there are 120,000 homeless people. Where should they stand to generate an address that would then become their residence, that the state would know because they are homeless? Have you thought about that? Have you put in place measures for people who are like that, who are going to be very fluid in terms of their movement, very nomadic and very itinerant? Then one of the most interesting characters for me in terms of rights in the context of citizen identification systems has been lawyer Francis Atta, who has at least on 2-3 occasions taken the state to court on how the state is wanting to implement some of these systems. And here he makes the point. I want the court to declare that the digital address code is an illegality, and hence prospective applicants or Ghanaian citizens who are willing and present themselves at the NIA to be registered, National Identification Authority, to be registered, should not be denied the Ghana card on the basis of not having a digital address code. I feel this makes a lot of sense. I still don't understand why one status as a citizen and the rights that accrue from having that status or living that status should be in any way tied to the possession of a digital address. I don't understand why your citizenship should be tied to the possession of a GPS coordinate, which basically should have been a function of the state in terms of creating a reliable and uniform addressing system across the country. So to these concerns, the state has tried to also put in place some mitigation measures. And my question will always be, are these resolutions or these are just placations? The first one, which I think goes a very long way, is that for most of these, or for all of these ID projects, you can freely register. So there's no nominal cost attached to it. You don't have to pay money to register for a Ghana card. You don't have to pay money to register your SIM card. You don't have to pay money to generate a digital address. But I think that as the state has failed to ensure a successful implementation of the SIM registration regime, I mean, if anybody is following the issues, you realize that Ghana has done a re-registration exercise at least 3 times or 4 times in the last maybe 12 years, give or take. That shows the limits of the state in terms of realizing its ideal in practice. So in response to that, the state has recently come up with an app where people can then go on to register themselves. And they're saying that to use that app, you have to pay 5 cedis. It should be maybe 0.5 $0.50, I think. And the state has ensured that almost for all of these projects, despite the threats that it gives that, oh, if you don't register for your SIM card, we are going to block your phones, you are not going to be able to use your phones again. There have often been extensions. So whether it's for the Ghana card or whether it's for the SIM card, you find that eventually a certain mercy comes from the states, if I can put it in that perspective, and then the deadlines are extended. Probably that is also accounting for why there have been SIM re-registration exercises over the last 10 years. But it also means that these extended deadlines may be in response to the apathy of citizens, or we could read that apathy as resistance. A registered citizen can vouch for another during Ghana card registration. So this was very important. The state said, oh, you cannot come and register for your Ghana card with a voter's ID. And knowing that a lot of Ghanaians did not have any other card in addition to the voter's ID, they didn't have the alternative of a passport. The state said that, okay, well, where somebody has been able to get the Ghana card, then the person could vouch for you when you go to register. We just have to take note of who is vouching and also understand that the person is a citizen and has a Ghana card already. So this was a mitigation measure to ensure that if you didn't have any Ghana voter's ID, no, you didn't have a passport, then you can use the vouching system to register. And the government embarks on house numbering exercise. So initially, the task of generating a digital address was put on the shoulders of citizens. Get your phone out, download an app, stand anywhere in your house, generate an address, and let the states know that address. That was the initial plan. But again, because of apathy, which we could again read as resistance, what happened was that a lot of people did not do it. So the state eventually said that, okay, I'm going to go around the country and generate these addresses, put them on plates, and then tag them on houses, so that even if somebody said, oh, I don't have a phone, I'm not internet savvy, I'm not digitally savvy, I cannot generate the address on my own, the state would have that for you. So then you cannot have an excuse of not having a digital address. Then in Ghana too, there's the existence of a Data Protection Act. I think that is very much mirrored on the principles of the GDPR. And it is fulsome and holistic, although it probably has some downsides, but it's good to see that as far back as 2012, the state had that Data Protection Act. And then I talked about this earlier, a recent court decision to end EI 63 in the context of SIM card registration, where the emergency instrument was passed, but the court said that no, this violates the rights of citizens, so you cannot do that. As I have said, SIM registration has still gone on, so I don't know the length to which that court ruling goes or should have gone. Or are we just pretending that there was no court ruling at all? Then there's this big issue of citizens' resistance. So this is basically from the perspective of citizens as how they are soothing themselves amidst all of these. And probably I've touched on this earlier, that SIM card pre-registration, maybe, no, I've not touched on SIM card pre-registration. So when SIM registration was mooted by the state and implemented by the state, what a lot of citizens did to circumvent this requirement was to buy pre-registered SIM cards. So you find that people who were selling SIM cards would use their own IDs to register a SIM card and then just sell it to somebody else, because people were trying to resist. People were not pleased with the idea of submitting their documents and their information to the state. So then they will just buy a pre-registered SIM card. But the state's response to this was to put in law the fact that buying a SIM card registration or issuing a SIM card, buying a pre-registered SIM card was illegal and criminal. Then there are all of these questions about institutional barriers and enablers. I am still thinking about the quality of parliamentary deliberation, because I feel that a lot of the challenges emanate from there. For instance, when we are discussing SIM registration and parliamentarians make points like, oh, all over the world there is SIM registration. Is that really the case? Is the use of the mobile phone the same everywhere? As I mentioned earlier, isn't the use of a mobile phone in a postpaid manner very different from the use of a mobile phone in a prepaid manner? So if I'm using, which happens a lot, mostly in Ghana, if I'm using a phone in such a way that I always buy my credit or my unit or my time ahead of time, then must I be tracked? Very important question. And how do you then say that, oh, all over the world this is done? Are they really substantively the same? Then another question I think about is, how reliable are the courts and other rights commissions? I've asked this, I've wondered just a few minutes ago about the EI63. Yes, the court did well by saying that, oh, it should be deemed to be illegal, but the same legislation is going on. And to what extent are courts going to say that, no, again, I said stop, so stop? How activist is the Data Protection Commission? I would say that Ghana is one country with some of the best laws in theory on paper, but at the end of the day, there's always the question of what about the implementation to it? So if you see the Data Protection Act, it is not, let's say, the best in the world, but I think it should go a long way. But we don't necessarily have a Data Protection Commission which is activist, which is hunting people down, going into the space, making sure that people follow data protection principles. How dedicated are civil society organizations and the media to issues of identification and digitalism? My conclusion has always been that it's been treated more like a fad, like the flavor of the month approach. So if this is the crisis at the moment and it has to do with the Ghana card, let's talk about it. But there's no consistent check on the state and its allies in terms of how it is identifying citizens, how it is storing information, how it is sharing information, and the rules about how you could even access identification. I don't really find CSOs and media like in a dedicated way checking this and keeping tabs on this. To what extent do these new projects inherit and extend traditional institutional challenges? The reason for dedicating a whole chapter to the history of citizen identification systems in Ghana was to make a point that traditionally Ghana has not built, at least from the perspective of the state, identification registers that could have easily converted to a digital version. So historically, Ghana has never had a national ID project so that you could have easily done that conversion. The closest it came to that was in 1973, where they started, but I think less than a year afterward, the project died a natural death of a sort. So the state itself has not developed that level of competence. Even if it comes to birth registration, still, there are a lot of Ghanaians who do not have birth certificates. So that competence has not been there. That institutional synergy has not been there. So you find that there are a lot of different IDs. Now the Ghana card is trying to change that, but that is also hard, or that was at least some years ago very hard, because institutions prefer to be in their silos. Then they can have control over their ID budgets instead of saying that all of that should be to the National Identification Authority. They have 14 applets or 14 rooms for applications on the Ghana card. So instead of, let's say, the social insurance, the social security and national insurance outfit having its own SNIT card or its own insurance card, why don't you just make that an app on the Ghana card? Nobody wanted that. So that was also like an institutional or interinstitutional battle to navigate for a very long time. Conclusions. I see that in as much as I talk about, I don't really see the citizens really saying that they don't want these identification systems. In my interviews, in my understanding of the text that I've read from a lot of non-state actors, they seem to accept these projects. And I've been thinking about why. Why is there this huge surveillance component in the hands of a state that cannot be trusted, but people still want, people still won't say that they don't want it. And I realized that maybe the solution or the reason or the rationale is very simple, that the underperformance of the state itself is an excuse, that if we have these things, the state can see better, the state can perform better. In a situation where people deem the state as having not performed good or well over its length of stay, then it becomes very easy for people to say, oh, if this is going to fix the state, then I'm going to eventually benefit from it. So why don't we have something like that? Then I also think about the influence of international and local institutions, where increasingly biometric systems, digital addressing systems, SIM registration systems are being promoted by international institutions, international organizations as what a state must have, or at least what a global south state must have in order to develop. The question has always been, is that how global north countries actually developed? If you are thinking about development again in the context of industrialization, in the context of the social economy or socio-economics. Then the development, I also think about how development is decentering other critical concerns. I made a point that although there have been concerns about citizenship and not being recognized, although there have been concerns about privacy and all of that, I feel once development is thrown in as a rationale, then it decenters these other critical concerns, privacy, citizenship, because development over time has been framed and crafted and promoted as existential. This is what we need. So a lot of conversations in global south countries, whether it is India, whether it is Ghana, whether it's Nigeria, makes it look like, oh, the state is failing, or the society is failing, or the state and society are failing because they don't have this level of development. So anything that says that, oh, this is going to bring development, almost is sold. Then there's a point about less contested route to building a surveillance state. Again, it flows from the idea that if development is existential, then we need it. If it is to the core of our existence and that's necessary, then we need it, which means that the state can keep using development as a rationale and in the end build a very, very effective surveillance state. And we don't know. This is the point I make in my work, that the first part is we can trust the state may build these systems, but we cannot trust that the state will be fair in how it uses this system. We cannot trust that the state will be arbitrary in how it uses these systems. Then I keep questioning the claims of inclusion. The first part, as you see, is that there are people who, according to certain people and institutions, are not Ghanaians. Can we really use technology to resolve the age-old question about citizenship or not? That is the first part to it. But I also wonder about the point about inclusion from the perspective of inclusion for who, or to serve whose ends, or to serve whose purposes. One of the interesting concepts that I came across was what is known as predatory inclusion, where we are sucking you in just to prey on you, especially from the perspective of capitalism. So you find that in the end, mobile number interoperability means that if you don't officially have a bank account, at least you have a bank account in a certain sense sitting on your phone. Now that can be used as a basis for building a credit history for you that fits you into a certain system, and that will mean that eventually, and this has been written about in places like I think Kenya and South Africa, where people keep getting offers of loans at very predatory interest rates, and in the end people just get so indebted that they don't see the value of being included in this so-called formal capitalist system. So whose purpose and whose ends would these inclusions or forms of inclusion serve? So thank you, and I wait and look forward to a very engaging conversation after here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Smith, for the wonderful presentation. It was very interesting. We learned a lot. We have a question from Aaron Martin in the chat. Aaron says, fascinating talk, Smith. I learned a lot. I'm on a very weak connection at the moment, so I'll ask my question here. The digital address program is fascinating for different reasons, including, as you point out, the problem of many lacking fixed addresses. Do you know if other countries have attempted similar initiatives? Perhaps geographers among us have a sense of whether this sort of thing has been undertaken in other places, as I see some geographers in the chat.
I know that there's a company called What 3 Words. I think I got the name right. And they've been trying to implement this system across other African countries. At least I know that Cote d'Ivoire or the Ivory Coast has attempted to do this. So yes, it's not just Ghana, except that Ghana has a way of always framing itself as, oh, we are the first to do this. But a lot of times, maybe the core technologies have been tested out elsewhere. But at least I know that What 3 Words, if anybody would Google What 3 Words, then they'll find their footprints elsewhere.
Thank you.
And I should say hi to Aaron. Yeah, he's a good friend.
I hope that was a satisfying answer, Aaron. He says, I think Ghana was definitely the first to try the common monitoring platform. And he says, thanks, Smith. Mm-hmm. Okay, so
yeah,
any other?
So that also comes up with a lot of political economy questions. Maybe we don't even have the time to delve into that. But the company undertaking that program is a company that eventually became known as Kelny GVG. So maybe I should put this in the chat. Yeah, and I think GVG, Global Voices Group or something, is registered somewhere in the Caribbean, I feel. Is it Haiti, somewhere like that? And it has a very long history of also being predatory, in terms of this whole idea of core monitoring and selling it to global South countries. And there have been scandals around it. So that's also something good to pay attention to. But the other point is that there was supposed to be a local content component to it. And then they ended up partnering with a company called Kelny. And when people research the history of Kelny did nothing about telecommunications previously. So this is where you start wondering about the political economy dimensions of it. Why is it this company getting the contract? Why is it not somebody who actually does this? And what are the implications of doing that? So I've put it in the chat, Kelny GVG. So let me just say CMP, Common Monitoring Platform. If you just read about GVG and their scandals, you see how interesting it is.
Fran has a very interesting comment. Interesting here is also the Geo for Good initiative, where geocodes are used as means for creating addresses for people living in slums. I think that ties back to the question of Aaron.
I think that it's very important. You know how now we are attaching the word good. Maybe this is for those in rhetoric. The word good to a lot of these systems. So data for good, geo for good. And I think one of the persons I quoted talked about this idea of slum dwelling, because there's a certain level of impermanency about a slum. A slum could actually go down tomorrow. So if you really sit down to think about, we are generating a digital address for somebody in a slum, tomorrow the slum could go away. And what does that mean for the state in terms of knowing its citizens? And what does it mean for the citizen in terms of going to the state to claim its rights?
Isaac says, thanks a lot for the presentation, Smith. My work centers on the use of geo information for monitoring and mapping informal settlements. And as I recall, you mentioned the situation of homelessness and informal settlements briefly. I was curious if you could speak more of the kind to the enforcement of the Ghana cards. And it seems you're already talking about it.
Yeah, so I'll just basically say that in a very practical sense, their resistance is almost like natural and expected because they don't have a spot. You know, I met people during my research who would say that, well, I just asked a friend for his or her digital address, then to go and register, which means that they just want to check the box. But is it really their address? So that whatever purposes that the state thinks it wants to use digital addresses for is defeated right from the beginning. Those in management studies will say garbage in, garbage out, and this is a classic example of that. I don't have a place. I've asked my friend to give me his or her address. I have to use that, you know. But really, that's inaccurate information on a citizen. That doesn't tie a citizen to any specific spot. But I feel that field work to really go down there and ask these people themselves about how they navigated that, you know, have a more deep conversation, a deeper conversation with them will go a long way, you know, to helping us understand how they navigated that. But at least I know that there were people who were just borrowing digital addresses.
If no one else has a comment or question, I'd like to ask a question also about resistance. And you talk about the reaction from the citizens. At the beginning, we saw the memes, like they're mostly making fun of the Ghana cards and not really seeing the value. And that it's more a sort of question of priorities for them as opposed to the big brother concerns. That it was only mentioned by a member of parliament who then kind of changed course afterwards. So my question is, are there any efforts? Is there any awareness among the greater public of this, or are there efforts to raise awareness about these issues, about the dangers, about the risks?
Yeah, I'd say that typically in the conversations that I've come across, it's been think tanks, it's been civil society organizations, it's been pressure groups who have been at the forefront of at least explicitly talking about resistance. These projects are in such a way that you cannot not know about it, you know, because if you don't register your SIM card, then obviously you are not going to get all of these other things. If you don't have a Ghana card, you are not going to access your rights as a citizen. So it is common knowledge. These projects are common knowledge, but they are really in the context of, and that's what I try to keep bringing up. They are really in the context of development, and sometimes it marginalizes these issues because if people feel that, oh, we need development, we need the state to be stronger so that we can even access. We need the state to be stronger. We need to identify us, you know. Then we can access our rights from the state. Then we can access social protection. Not vicious, but maybe a virtuous cycle of if I can see my citizens, I can tax them appropriately, then I can expand the kitty for social welfare. Because otherwise, what is happening has always been, and this is a bit of a roundabout, but I think it's an important point. What has been happening is that states like Ghana, when they are having to roll out social interventions, often end up being having like mass enrollments for them in the context of if you are talking about free SHS or free senior high school education, for instance, or capitation grants, which is like making basic public basic schools free. The state doesn't have the data to say that, okay, this person earns this income, so it means that this person cannot access this policy. But because the state doesn't have that, it means that the state is always rolling out mass programs. Everybody can access it, and which undermines the capacity of the state and also undermines the benefits that a poor person could have actually gotten. So once the situation, the conversations are situated in this context, it becomes, as I keep referring to it, an existential issue. But there have been protestations. If you think about the the SIM registration, for instance, I talked about how pre-registering a SIM card or buying a pre-registered SIM card is an example, of resistance. Recently, there are people who have gone on demonstration against the SIM registration deadline, where the state said that if you don't register your SIM card by this time, then you can't have access to your phone. People have done that. There have been people who have taken the kids, the court, the state to court, on SIM registration, on the digital addresses, on the Ghana card. So I'll say that there's a certain level of resistance in there, but I don't want to make it look like data protection or surveillance is the main contest for that resistance.
Okay, many thanks. I see a lot of questions coming in the chat. Franklin Ohai says Nigeria has a similar situation. Citizens must obtain a national identification number to register their SIM cards. The voters' cards, passports, and other valid forms of identification are not accepted. The SIM cards are also linked to bank accounts through the BVN system. We have a quick question by Abdullah Elbi. I assume the deployment and use of face recognition technologies is following the Ghana biometric card initiative to complete the surveillance puzzle you described. Could you please further detail the surveillance practices regarding cameras, public spaces, and the use of biometric? Also, do you know whether any Chinese or European company assisting the government while operating the ID and biometric systems?
So in terms of the companies, I would say that Ghana has, at least for these particular projects, been in a very interesting spot where a lot of times the main contractor would tend to be a Ghanaian company. You have to then look deeper to see the technologies at play. So for instance, if you take the digital addressing system, the company is Vodacom. It is a Ghanaian company. But then if you really look at the technologies at play, it's basically Google Maps, and the GPS coordinates that they generate that have been the basis for the NGPAS. If you take the Ghana card, for instance, the company at the forefront of it would be IMS 1, IMS 2. But historically, you find that the actual software, whether it is the AFIS, the fingerprint identification system, whether it is that or whether it is technology so that people using Braille can then use these cards and stuff. Or you find that the actual technologies at play are almost like subcontracted to different companies around the world. So it's an interplay, and sometimes I refer to the Ghana card as the United Nations, because if you start thinking about where the technologies are coming from, the US, Germany, and stuff like that, it's a conglomeration eventually. There was so I would say that the only time I remember hearing a China dimension to it, the only time that China came into the conversation, at least for the not for the digital addressing system, not for the SIM registration, but for the Ghana card, was at the time that the state wanted money to finance the project. So the Chinese Infrastructure Development Corporation, I think CIDC, something along those lines, came in with an offer that if you give the contract to us, then we'll give you a loan. Eventually, and this is where the international dimension comes in, the World Bank was against this because the World Bank in 2013 had also given Ghana some funding to do that project. So multiple or maybe different varying geopolitical interests therein, but eventually the contract wasn't given to the Chinese company. Yeah, and I think a point was made about Nigeria also having these things, and that is where I feel like increasingly there is an international system that is creating the impression that these are the things that global South countries must do if they want to have a certain specific kind of development. So you see that the ID4D survey, like all of those are the ID4D, like as an institution in itself. All of these are institutions that are being built around that idea to formalize it, to institutionalize it, to make it the way to go, to make it common sense. And I feel that that is why it is possibly around the same time that a lot of different African countries are pursuing the same project. So in a certain sense, I try to make the argument that even the conception of the state on the right course to development is now being changed and edited to suit these ID projects and the specifics in terms of even having GPS coordinates as a dimension of it, having facial recognition as a dimension of it, having biometrics as a dimension of it. I'll give the example of the Ghana card. So the Ghana card, this probably will be the second or third iteration of the Ghana card, because somewhere around 2012, 2013, the World Bank had only come in to give Ghana money for the Ghana card project, because the initial Ghana card project only took 4 fingerprints in terms of the biometric registration, took 4 fingerprints, and then it was a 2-dimensional barcode card. And per the World Bank, this was not the system. This was not the norm. This was not apt as a form of technology. We needed a smart card. We needed a card that could take 10 fingerprints and not 4, you see. So these are where you start, these are the moments you start seeing the international dimension of it and the creation of the perception that this is what an ideal global South state should be doing. Yeah, so I see Aaron is saying, I'm sorry for jumping, Bam. I see Aaron is saying, but it's a post office initiative in Ghana. Yeah, so that is how interesting that institution is. So the oversight for the project is the Ministry of Communications, then tied to the government, the office of the government machinery, and then the vice president's office. So when it comes to the actual strategizing and communication about that card and about that system, it's been done by the executive properly, so-called, via the Ministry of Communications, via the vice president's office, via the office of the government machinery. The post office then is thrown in as probably the direct government agency to utilize this. So it is very quite, should I use the word deceptive? Because really, if you think about it, the post office will just use it as any other organization will use it, you know, where they just say, oh, okay, what is your digital address? I am delivering a product to that address. But in the larger scheme of things, although they called it the Ghana Post GPS app, probably initially that was what it was supposed to be, maybe something for just for the Ghana Post to use. But to the point where, or at the point where it is tied to your Ghana card, it is tied to your SIM registration, then it goes way beyond the Ghana Post. So, I mean, it is a good catch there to see a certain level of inconsistency in terms of how the product has been presented and how it has actually been deployed.
I think we have another question by Ariana. Thanks for your work and presentation. What do we know about the data collected on citizens through this identification system are being used by the state, and which actors, public versus private, may store and analyze the data?
Mm-hmm. So I'll basically say that these are projects that some of them are still ongoing. For instance, if you take the SIM registration exercises, it's still ongoing. September 30th, the government said that was the last deadline, but I doubt. So it's hard for me to even start talking about how the data is being used. The Ghana card registration, maybe that is recently completed, but I know that there are still a lot of people who have not been enrolled. So I take this more from the perspective of a system that is being built, and in terms of the actual use, I would just say that we live to see it. But you hope that the Data Protection Act can then favor citizens and ensure that it gives the state some boundaries in terms of how they might use such personal information. I'd say. So I would just say that we can keep an eye on it. Yeah, but so far, I don't think there's enough because the systems are still being created. Or maybe if they are using it, it's not out there in the public domain yet.
We have 9 more minutes left for some questions. So if anyone has some pressing questions, don't hesitate to either put them in the chat or turn on your camera and microphone. If there's no other questions, maybe I could invite Smith to have some concluding remarks or just some final words, and then we can close the session.
Yeah, I'll just say that this has been a thrilling conversation. I've really enjoyed the kind of questions and comments that have come up. We keep looking into these issues, but my point basically is to say that the moment you frame these surveillance-oriented systems in the context of development, then I feel that we should start having different conversations, including even who is getting these contracts. Are we following older cycles of outsourcing these contracts to foreign companies who claim to have the needed competence, and needed sometimes even initial financing and all. To a certain extent, Ghana provides some value as a model in terms of how these contracts are going to possibly like local companies, although some companies will eventually be subcontracted to foreign software and hardware companies. But for me, that is valuable. If this is where we want to put our money, then let's just make sure that we keep as much of it in these economies as possible. But we also need a lot more consistency from civil society organizations, think tanks, the media, as a check, because these things are not going away. If the whole country is being imagined as one that is going to be based on the interoperability of these systems, then it means that our rights are conjoined, with these projects, and we cannot take our eyes off the ball at all. I think there's a question.
Yes, indeed. So Fran asks, thanks so much for the talk. Interesting to learn more about this initiative. Maybe a question that would be interesting for some of my students is how these RDs are getting linked to land rights registers.
Okay. So I'll say that land ownership is a huge point of confusion, of illegality, of violence in Ghana, where sometimes you find one piece of land being sold by different people, or sometimes by the same person to different people. And this again is tied to an ineffective history, or maybe a poor history of institutionalizing land registration in the country. I would say that in very recent experience, what I find is that there are also investments in building technological systems for land registration in Ghana. There's a big conversation about how I've heard a few things about how people are navigating or circumventing these systems. Maybe that can be a conversation for later. But I know that now when you go register a land or when you want to change the title on the land, you have to add a digital address. And I think that it makes a lot of sense. You can call it digital address, you can call it GPS coordinates, but at least by having those things there, at least you know that wherever you are in the world, you can know exactly where that piece of land sits. But that doesn't, that is where there's always a limitation for technology, because it doesn't actually resolve the main question of ownership and violence. That also results from long historical, I'd say, inefficiencies and ineffectiveness if you take land registration as a regime in Ghana.
Okay, well, with this comment, I think we can conclude the session. Once again, many thanks, Smith, for for joining us today and having the interesting talk. Voilà, all participants can have a look at our website for our upcoming seminars, should you be of interest. So we hope to see you soon at one of our next seminars. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everybody. This has been good. And feel free to get in touch at any time to discuss anything further. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Bram.
Hi, Smith.
Yeah, so this was good. Thank you.
Yeah, it was nice. How did you experience it?
I think it was very engaging. The comments, the questions. It's always the part about people not putting their cameras on, and because I think that it could add a lot to some of these conversations. But still, we have gotten used to it by now. People are not going to. So that's fine.
Yeah, indeed. I was surprised to see that everybody was using the chat, because usually we get more interaction. I mean, I think the turnout was okay. I think we had like 40 registrations and we had like 25 people, which is in the session, which is okay.
Yeah.
But usually there's more interaction with directly from the crowd. But anyway, it turned out people were having issues with connection and they were on trains. So
yeah, and maybe sometimes too that I don't know where people were connecting from. Because at the time of day, I guess this is like work time basically. For some, they are either waking up now, and for some, it's like in the thick of the day. So I can understand they are just probably following and working at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
it was good.
Okay, I'm very glad that you liked it. I liked it also very much. It was good.
Let's connect again. I have another.
Indeed.
I have a full day meeting at 9:30. So I want to see if I can catch an hour of sleep.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Okay, many thanks. Let's keep in touch and see you, man. Cheers.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.